Welcome to The Explainer. We're going to break down something pretty wild today. How a single social media ban could literally ignite a revolution and bring down an entire government.
I mean, that was the question everyone was asking back in September 2025. Nepal was just completely gripped by these massive protests, so intense that they actually forced the prime minister to resign. Just like that.
But here's the thing, this explosion of anger, it didn't just come out of nowhere. No, this was a crisis that had been simmering for a long, long time.
Okay, so to really get what happened, we're going to break it down into 4 key parts. First, we'll look at the digital spark that started it all. Then, the decades of dry tinder, the fuel that was just waiting for a flame. After that, we'll dive into the inferno of the protests themselves. And finally, we'll see what's left after clearing all the smoke.
All right, let's get into our first section. So where did this whole thing kick off? Well, it all started with a single government directive, the one that became that digital spark.
So, picture this. It's September 4th, 2025. The government of Nepal just pulls the plug on the country's most popular social media sites. We're talking Facebook, X, YouTube, all of it. And that single act set off a massive chain reaction. And this is where things get really interesting. You've got this huge disconnect. On one hand, the government's official story was, oh, this is just about taxes and registration, boring bureaucratic stuff. But on the other hand, a whole generation of young Nepalese were saying, no way. They believed the real reason was to shut down this viral Nepo kid trend that was exposing the ridiculously lavish lifestyles of politicians' kids, a total clash of narratives.
Okay, so that brings us to our next section. And this is so crucial to understand. That social media ban, it was just the spark. The fuel for this massive fire, well, that had been piling up for decades. If you look at the heart of Nepal's problems, it really boils down to this one thing: chronic political instability. It's something that has absolutely paralyzed the country's ability to move forward. Get this, 13. That's the number of different governments Nepal has had in just 17 years since they got rid of the monarchy. 13 governments in 17 years. I mean, how can you make any kind of long-term progress when the leadership is a revolving door? It's pretty much impossible. And all that instability, it just breeds hopelessness. You've got a youth unemployment rate over 20%. That forces thousands of young, talented people to leave the country every single day, just to find work, a massive brain drain. So for the young people who stay, social media isn't just about memes and cat videos, it's a lifeline. It's a vital connection to opportunities, to the world outside.
Now let's throw some deep-seated corruption into this already messy situation. On the Corruption Perception Index, Nepal ranks 110th out of 180 countries. And for the average person, that's not just some abstract number on a chart. No, it was a daily reality, a poison they felt was seeping into every part of their country right from the very top.
So you can see how all these pieces fit together. It's like the perfect storm, right? And it's not just a feeling. Academic studies back it up. They point to a system that is just riddled with corruption, propped up by weak institutions, and has a complete and total lack of accountability. And this is where all that systemic frustration becomes intensely personal. You have young Nepalis, right? Struggling every day. And then they go online and see this. This quote from a user on Reddit kind of sums it up perfectly. They see political families with millions in wealth, while the prime minister's official salary is peanuts. That stark contrast, that feeling of us versus them, was being shared and amplified online for literally everyone to see. All right, that brings us to the inferno itself. We've got the spark, we've got the fuel, so how did this whole tinderbox finally and violently explode?
The speed of what happened next is just staggering. We're talking about going from online anger over a ban to tens of thousands of people on the streets to the actual downfall of the government in just 5 days. 5, that's it.
And the protesters themselves, mostly Gen Z, folks under 30, they were incredibly resourceful. They used everything in their arsenal. Yeah, mass demonstrations in the streets, but also smart digital tactics. They were using VPNs to get around the social media ban, the very tool meant to silence them. They were organized, they were determined, and they were not backing down.
And the government's response? It was swift and it was brutal. Instead of de-escalating, they met the protesters with tear gas, water cannons, rubber bullets, and even live ammunition. The violence just skyrocketed, and tragically, it led to a serious loss of life.
Reports from groups like Human Rights Watch and journalists who were right there on the ground were horrifying. This eyewitness account says it all. They said security forces were firing directly at students, indiscriminately. Just think about that. These were young people, many of whom were reportedly still in their school uniforms.
19. That was the official number of protesters killed. You might think a tragedy like that would crush a movement, right? But it did the exact opposite. It supercharged it. It took all that anger and grief and focused it into one unified nationwide demand: accountability. Now it was about more than just a ban. It was about justice.
So, that brings us to our final section, clearing the smoke. The Prime Minister is gone. The country is in shock. So, what happens now? What's left after the fires go out and the smoke starts to clear?
I mean, look at the immediate outcomes. The Prime Minister resigned, the social media ban was lifted, other key ministers were out. In a stunningly short amount of time, the protesters basically achieved all their primary goals. But that success created a massive power vacuum. They'd torn down the old structure for sure. The big question was, what or who would be built in its place? And that really is the critical question, right? Because you have to remember, the anger wasn't just directed at one guy, one prime minister. It was aimed at the entire political system. They weren't just mad at KP Sharma Oli. They were fed up with all the leaders from the old guard who they felt had failed them for decades.
But out of all that chaos, a new kind of figure has started to emerge. All eyes are now turning to Kathmandu's mayor, a guy named Balan Shah. He's a former rapper, seen as a total outsider. And that's exactly his appeal. For many young Nepalese, he represents a potential break from the politics of the past, someone who isn't part of the establishment they just tore down.
So what's the takeaway here? Nepal's Gen Z revolution has absolutely forced a turning point for the nation. But the big question remains, is this the beginning of a brand new chapter with real, lasting reform? Or is it just the start of another painful cycle of political instability and infighting? The spark was digital. The fire was very, very real. And now, an entire nation is holding its breath, waiting to see what will grow from the ashes.